I wanted to talk for a little bit about my favorite Beach Boys album. And that sentence itself feels weird to say because for the longest time I had this idea of the Beach Boys as this yuppie, totally uninteresting kind of plastic group. And maybe that is the case for the early Beach Boys in the same way that it's the case for the Beatles until like Rubber Soul. Anyway, it's been a nice surprise for me personally to discover the Beach Boys and have my expectations about what they are and what their music represents be consistently challenged. In a couple of years, I went from thinking that people only really liked the Beach Boys ironically or because they listened to them when they were young, to being a fan myself. Albums like Pet Sounds, Holland, Sunflower, and even a few of their earlier albums like Surfin' USA, I generally enjoy. But for me, the Beach Boys at their absolute peak, and the one album that's actually in my top 10 of all albums, is their 1971 album Surf's Up, which I want to talk about right now. I mention the year because it's pretty relevant to the reasons I enjoy this album so much. At this point, they're like 10 years into making music. The original gimmick, the surfing stuff, is pretty much passé at this point, and the Flower Child aesthetic too is on the way out. So both these worlds that people really identify the Beach Boys with are either gone or falling apart rapidly, and at least to me this album is a means of answering the question of what's left for the band now that the creative wells that they've been tapping for the last decade are drying up. And the answer is really interesting because at least to me, it's like they recognize that the ship is sinking, but rather than try to escape it, they're content to just ride it to the bottom of the ocean. This album thematically feels like a complete surrender. It's incredibly depressing. Every song is either a retreat into some kind of idealized version of the past, or a glorification of complete escapism. It's the Beach Boys taking this image that they've built of surfing, and summer love, and youth, all these topics that were so popular in the 60s, and twisting them in a way that makes them seem almost pathetic. It's almost as if the summer of love has come and gone, giving way to a winter where everything that was beautiful and new has slowly decayed and fallen away. Let me repeat that this is a Beach Boys album. The album itself is 10 songs long, and clocks in at just over half an hour long, so all the songs are tight and coherent, unlike something like Pet Sounds, whose main appeal, at least for me, is how maximalist and eclectic it is. If you're like me and you go into this album with nothing more than a cursory knowledge of the Beach Boys, and you see an album called Surf's Up, it's easy to assume that it's just going to be like their early songs, catchy but pretty mindless songs about the topics I just mentioned. But from the very beginning, that expectation gets subverted. I mean, look at the album cover. Does this look like the album art for something called Surf's Up? The statue that the album cover is based on is called The End of the Trail. It's located in Wisconsin and depicts a beaten down and broken Native American warrior and his horse. On top of that, it's shaded to look like the pair are at the bottom of the ocean. Literally the opposite of surfing. Digging into the track list, the first song is called Don't Go Near the Water. It exists as a serviceable environmental song, but perhaps more significantly, it exists as a repudiation of the kind of songs the Beach Boys were known for in the early 60s. Think about it. What could be further from carefree songs about romps on the beach than a song about responsibility and ecological consciousness? The song itself is kind of cheesy, but I love it just because it's the opening track on an album called Surf's Up by a band called the Beach Boys, and its main message is to stay away from water. The second song, Long Promised Road, is where the real meat of the album begins. Musically, it's pretty by the books. There are vocal harmonizations, eclectic instruments, catchy pop beats. It's pretty much, your typical 60s song. But lyrically, it's decidedly atypical. These are not lyrics about contentment, hope, and youthful optimism. It's a reaction to those things. You can think of it almost as a response song to a song like The Times They Are A-Changin'. In that song, Bob Dylan sings about a future of infinite potential that's going to sweep aside the old order and usher in some new, just world. If that song is about revolution, Long Promised Road is about what comes after, when the old order is swept away and what replaces it isn't much better. There's a kind of assuredness in a song like The Times They Are A-Changin' that asserts that once the past is gone, it's going to be gone for good. While in Long Promised Road, there's an admission that it's so hard to shed the life of before to let my soul automatically soar. The song is an admission that real lasting change, whether in a person or in a society, does not come easily and does not come all at once. Progress is not linear, nor do things only move forward. The ultimate message of the song is to keep up the struggle, even though the road is, quote, never ending, never ending. But even that is bittersweet. It's a fight that requires constant energy with little hope of victory. The third track, Take a Load Off Your Feet, is probably the most whimsical song on the album. It reminds me almost of Maxwell's Silver Hammer. It's a very silly, very catchy, upbeat song. And I love that last Take Good Care of Your Feet, Pete. The way the vocals kind of vibrate and jump around is a really cool sound. My favorite song on the album, and the song that I think is the purest distillation of what the album represents, is called Disney Girls 1957. What you have in this song is a perfect representation of absolute escapism. Disney girls are these perfect creatures who live these sanitized, impossibly perfect lives where any ambiguity is mercilessly scrubbed away and conflict inevitably gives way to happily ever after. And 1957, of course, was well before the upheaval of the 60s, and was a time where the members of the Beach Boys were either children or adolescents. Bruce Johnson, who wrote the lyrics, for example, was 15. There was, at the time of the album being recorded, a deep romanticization of the stability, the wholesomeness, and the security of the 1950s. The show Happy Days, which began to air a couple years after Surf's Up came out, being the perfect example of the whitewashed 1950s in the eyes of people 20 years later.
How come? 'Cause I'm the Fonz, huh? Hey!
All three of the words of the title share this gnawing sense of unreality when you hear them. Disney movies barely resemble anything close to real life, women aren't two-dimensional wives and mothers, and shows like Happy Days intentionally present a world that did not and could not ever exist. And the impossibility of this world is reflected in the song's lyrics. Oh reality, it's not for me, and it makes me laugh. Oh fantasy world and Disney girls, I'm coming back. This song, which is effectively disguised in the format of a traditional ballad, depicts a complete withdrawal from contemporary existence. The imagery is really pretty remarkable, full of Tootsie Rolls, local girls in a small town who really like church, bingo chances, and old-time dances, and country shade and lemonade. It's easy to read lyrics like this and just dismiss it as some old hokey bullshit, but that's completely the point. They're juvenile and bloodless, but they're also safe and wholesome. The lyrics describe someone to whom real life, with all its ugliness, edges, and scarcity, has become impossible to live in. And so why not return to a better time? Or better yet, some warped version of that time, sweetened by nostalgia and your own skewed perception. Student demonstration time I don't even really want to acknowledge for three reasons. Number one, it sucks. Number two, it doesn't really fit onto the album, except for the fact that it brings up a massacre, in this case the one at Kent State University in 1970, and demonstrates the sickness of the times that the rest of the album refers to. The third reason is that it kind of strikes me as insincere that a band like the Beach Boys would make a protest song. Just like Don't Go Near the Water, it almost feels exploitational, like they took two hippie causes, environmentalism and the anti-war movement, and wrote songs about them for no other reason than it was popular to write songs about them. And it shows in the lyrics, which in my opinion don't have any particular depth or insight that you couldn't find in any other protest song. So that's enough of that. Feel Flows, the first song on side 2, adds a psychedelic twist to the record, with both a very warped, very otherworldly production, and lyrics that seem to be scattered imagery from an acid trip. It introduces drugs as another means of escapism. The beauty, the order, and the sense of symmetry and interconnectedness that comes when you take LSD is just as potent a distraction as daydreaming about the past. The lyrics refer to psychedelics as potential to help someone face an unpleasant experience with a new perspective and find some kind of peace with inner demons, but it also mentions their ability to make life fade away. Just like any kind of therapeutic solution or medication, there exists the danger of losing yourself completely. There's often a thin line between treatment and abuse. Looking at Tomorrow, to bring up the Beatles again, reminds me a lot of I'm Only Sleeping. It still carries forward this idea of frustration with the world and a feeling of helpless resignation, but this time in the context of a lost job. The lyrics about a guy who's either unemployed or underemployed in some dead-end situation that he sees no real way to get out of. He's frustrated that he has to depend on others for support and feels like his talents are being wasted. Despite all this, he does have hope that he's not going to be trapped forever, that sometime soon some opportunity or change will arise to get him out of the slump he's found himself in. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. Day in the Life of a Tree is probably the most on-the-nose song of the album, but that isn't entirely a bad thing. In this song we have lyrics that spell out pretty unambiguously all the other stuff we've been talking about. It's a story about someone whose strength has slowly faded away. You can imagine a tall oak tree that's slowly, almost imperceptibly, been brought low by the never-ending march of time. It's the idea of outliving yourself brought to the extreme. This world that once seemed so bright and full of promise has been drained away, leaving nothing but a husk behind. Incidentally, while the song obviously was meant to be metaphorical for a withdrawal from the world, I think on a surface level it works better as an environmental song than Don't Go Near the Water. For instance, the lyrics, "Trees like me weren't meant to live if all this world can give is pollution and slow death," obviously has more to it than just what it literally means, but the face value still seems sincere in the way that something like Don't Go Near the Water doesn't. Till I Die is definitely a close second as far as favorite songs on the album goes. It's interesting again how they take the traditional themes of a Beach Boys song, namely the ocean, and twist it to be oppressive instead of liberating. In this case, metaphorically, they create this kind of hopeless deterministic reality, a cork on the ocean, a rock in a landslide, a leaf in the wind. All the while this desperate refrain, "How deep is the ocean?" constantly repeats. If surfing is a triumph of man over nature, you can think of a surfer harnessing the tide and seemingly directing it. Then this cork floating on the ocean shows a different side of the relationship between man and the sea, the unfathomable scale of the ocean and the equally unfathomable smallness of man, who is carried along not by his own will, but by the will of the world around him. Rounding things out is the titular Surf's Up, a song that's probably the most Pet Sounds-esque of the album, but nevertheless stays within the thematic framework we've been talking about. The lyrics, as far as I can tell, are actually just nonsense, but it's a melancholic kind of nonsense, you know? It has a less coherent hearkening to youth and innocent than something like Disney Girls, but wrapped up in an idiosyncratic package that I don't think anyone but Brian Wilson could have come up with. A strange, unique, but still awesome song if there ever was one. Anyway, that's about all I got to say about Surf's Up. If you listen to the album, or if you have any thoughts about the album, I'd love to hear them in the comments, and if you'd like to see more videos from me, feel free to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.